All right, to get started here, you just need a few simple things here in your kitchen. Hopefully you guys have a food scale. This is pretty useful for how I do this. Then you're gonna need a bunch of flour. We just use all-purpose flour, although you could use bread flour if you wanted. We're gonna need some water, about half a liter or so, and then a big bowl. The last thing that you need is the starter. And so we got this actually from King Arthur Baking Company. It's this little crock and it comes with some starter that you feed. So that's gonna be the first step that we talk about in the process, is feeding your sourdough, especially in preparation for making bread. You can also do this, once a week, once a month, just to make sure your sourdough starter stays healthy. So to get started, we'll get our scale. We're gonna put our bowl on top of here and zeroize it. The big thing here is that you gotta remember is it's basically 1 to 1 to 1. So if you use 1 gram of starter, you use 1 gram of flour, 1 gram of water. And then it scales up from there. So in general, what we use when we make our starter, which we will do later in this video, is 127 grams of starter, 127 grams of flour, and 127 grams of water. So for now, we're going to be making a couple loaves of bread tomorrow. So we're actually going to take all of this starter that's in here, and it's probably going to be about 400 grams or so, and dump it in this bowl, making sure to measure it so we can add the equal amounts of flour and water. Now just remember that this starter in here is really hard to get off if it dries. So what I will typically do is I'll save this spoon to use to stir with, but then I'll fill this with water in my sink. And that's just to make sure that it comes off easier, because we're gonna need that tomorrow when this starter for the bread is done and we make some bread. So we have 366 grams of starter. So we are going to add 366 grams of flour. Go ahead and zeroize your scale, and 366. You can do this multiple different ways, but I like to do this because it's most accurate. You can also use measuring cups to measure equal amounts of flour, water, and starter. I just like this. This is my way of doing it. It's worked. So 365, close enough. Okay, then we'll take 366 grams of water. Same thing. Close, 369. All right, it doesn't have to be perfect, just close-ish. And then we'll take it off the scale and we'll go ahead and stir this up with that spoon that we used to get the starter out of the crock. Now tomorrow we're gonna be making 2 loaves of sourdough bread with this. So that's why we use the entire starter that was in the crock. If you're only gonna make 1 loaf of bread, what I have done in the past is just taken 200 grams of starter and then use 200 grams of water and 200 grams of flour. Once it is all mixed in, I'll grab a knife and just kind of scrape off the excess off the spoon, because we want to save as much of this as possible. And then all we're going to do is cover this with plastic wrap and then put it on the countertop until tomorrow. You want to let it sit outside, not in the fridge, for 24 hours. The only time that you're really gonna keep this in the fridge is once your starter is made and you fed it and you put it back into the crock, you'll keep that in the fridge at all times. We have actually had this starter for about 2 years now, and it has not failed us yet. The cool thing with these starters is over time, they kind of become region specific, right? They kind of get adjusted, acclimated, pick up new bacteria, things like that, yeast from your local area. So. All right, this is done and in the bowl. I'm gonna go ahead and set this by our oven, and we will see you tomorrow in 24 hours.
This is the beginning of the rising of the sourdough starter. You can see it's bubbling and growing, and that's exactly what you want to see. So we're gonna go ahead and bring our fully risen starter over to the works area. Then we're just gonna move everything we don't need to the side, including our crock and our scale. As we look at this starter, you can see there's a lot more bubbles and it's risen a lot more, and then it started to fall, which is key for lactic acid buildup. Now I'm gonna go ahead and put the crock on the scale, zeroize it, and measure out 127 grams of water. And then I'm gonna measure out 127 grams of flour. And this is so that we can put this back in the fridge and keep the starter alive for the next time. Now we're going to add 127 grams of starter. Like I said, you can use cups and stuff like that. I just found that using a scale is a lot easier. After we get that in, we're going to use a spoon and make sure it's nice and stirred up. Make sure it's nice and even. And then we'll put the cover on and put it back in the fridge. Next, we're going to go ahead and get our dough ready to actually make our loaves. So we're going to dump all of that quote-unquote discard into the bowl and measure it out. In this case, it is about 800 grams of starter. Now I'm going to go ahead and put my sourdough bread pan on the scale and make sure to zeroize that. And I'm going to take half of that stuff that I put in the bowl of the starter. In this case, I'll put 400 grams of starter in there and leave 400 grams in the bowl to make my second loaf later. Make sure to cover it so no extra bacteria or anything get in there, because I'm just going to leave it out on the counter until I'm ready. Now we're going to go turn to our recipe. In this case, it calls for 320 grams of water. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract half of the amount of starter that we put in. That's because it's flour and water, equal parts. So if I had 200 grams of starter that I will use here, which is half of the 400 I put in, I still have 120 grams of water to put in. And I'm going to do the same for the flour. This recipe calls for 550 grams of flour, specifically bread flour, but I use all-purpose. So I'm going to subtract that 200 from the starter and have to put in 230 grams of flour. Next, I'll go ahead and add my sugar. It calls for 18 grams of sugar. And then it calls for 2 teaspoons of salt. And now it's going to ask for 2.5 tablespoons of butter. You could do this by weight, but they're measured out on the sticks, so that's easier to me. I just cut it in half to make 2 different pads, so I can put one on each side to keep it as homogeneous as possible. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the bread machine. This one has a specific dough function, which will stir it up, knead it, and let it rise. Now I'm going to set my oven to the bread proof function. If you don't have this, you can simply proof your dough on a warm spot in your kitchen, like above the fridge. Now my machine says this is complete, so the dough is risen and just sitting the machine ready to go. So now that our dough is finished and is risen in the bread machine, we'll go ahead and get it out and dump it down on this cutting board. One thing that can really help is getting your hands nice and floured up and putting some flour on the cutting board so it doesn't stick when you do this. The other thing that I almost forgot to do first, we're going to get some parchment paper. And if you have a proofing basket that'd work, we don't, so we just have a wood bowl that we use for proofing. And then we're also going to set our oven to our bread proof function to help it rise. If you don't have that, you can just leave it out in your kitchen. That'll work just fine for now. Now that's ready, we'll go ahead and get our bread out here, or dough rather, out of the bread machine. Use lots of flour to make sure it doesn't stick to your hands. And there we go. This is already risen, so we're just gonna take, put some flour on top to make sure it doesn't stick. And it's good consistency. So what we're gonna do is pull the corners up and over, and we'll do that a few different times, and that'll make sure to get a nice tight surface on the bottom. Like that. And then the other corners. And I'll do it a couple more times, just to make sure. Roll it over, and then I'll go ahead and put it in this proofing basket. Alright, now that that is in the proofing basket, or in this case a wooden bowl, we'll go ahead and get it proofing. So in this case in our oven, where it will sit for an hour and a half total. But we're going to set a timer for 1 hour, and we'll tell you why in an hour. So we'll go ahead and place our proofing bread into that top oven, and then after 1 hour, we'll set our bottom oven to convection bake at 400 degrees. We also want to put our Dutch oven into that bottom oven to preheat as well for the last 30 minutes of that bread rising. So you should be ready after an hour and a half total. So after your hour and a half, what we're going to do is go ahead and get a nice sharp knife, take out our proofed bread from that top oven, and then all we want to do here is score the top of that dough. In this case, I use an X, but you can use whatever design you want. I just prefer this because it's nice and simple. This actually lets the bread rise during baking and allow steam to escape, and it'll create a nice pattern. Then we go ahead and get our Dutch oven out. Careful, it's hot. Take the top off, and then just transfer that dough in the parchment paper into that Dutch oven. Put your top back onto it, and then we'll put it back into that 400-degree oven. Now, after 18 minutes, which is your first cycle in the oven, you're going to go ahead and take the top off of that Dutch oven, and then you put it in for another 15 minutes. After that's done, you can pull your bread out, and it should be nice and browned, puffed up, and looking amazing. Just be careful because you do need to take it out of the Dutch oven via the paper and then put it on a cooling tray. Be careful, the bread is really hot, so you might have to use an oven mitt or something like that, but it's super important to let it cool off on an oven rack or something like that. That'll help the crust really to develop. Do not put it in a bag while it's still hot.
That sourdough loaf looks amazing, especially from those cuts on top. It came out perfect. So that's really it, you guys. Just remember the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. So, starter to flour to water. That's all you really need to know. That's the super big secret. I use a scale, which is super helpful because I'm very analytical, but you can do cups and stuff like that. That will work just fine as well. Now, to keep your starter alive, it's really that simple. Just keep that crock in your fridge, and every 3 weeks or so, give it a stir. You can feed it. I like to do 127 grams as my ratio, so 127 grams of starter, 127 grams of flour, and 127 grams of water. I'll stir that up and put it back in the crock. So that way it'll keep going. Now, if you wanted to make bread the next day like we did earlier, I increased that to 200 grams of starter, 200 of flour, 200 of water, and that'll give me plenty of extra discard is what they call it, that I can make sure to take that 127 grams, put it into the starter to keep in my fridge, and all the rest I can make for a loaf. In today's video, I did 400 because I wanted extra to make 2 loaves, but pretty simple. 127 just to keep your starter alive, 200 if you're gonna make a loaf. It's that simple. If you guys have any questions, comments, any issues with how your sourdough is going, make sure to put them in the comments below. We truly appreciate it, you guys, and we'll talk to you next time.